Cassidy Arrows was used to encountering all sorts of human drama. She worked as a columnist for a small local newspaper and often met people down on their luck, but she had never expected to stumble upon someone so visibly broken in a dark alley late at night. That particular evening, she had stayed longer than usual at her favorite book cafe, finishing an article about community volunteers. It was chilly outside, with a brisk wind cutting through the streets, so she decided to take a shortcut home through a narrow alley she normally avoided after dusk. The rumble of distant traffic and the faint glow of a street lamp were her only companions. Halfway down the alley, she heard sobs echoing off the brick walls. At first, she thought it might be a stray cat or someone watching a video on their phone with the volume too high. But as she drew closer to the slumped figure near a stack of discarded cardboard boxes, she realized it was a man, curled in on himself, shoulders quivering with the force of his tears. Something in his posture spoke of desperation, a raw and devastating kind of sorrow. Cassidy's heart clenched. She hesitated for a brief second, reminding herself how dangerous it could be to approach a stranger alone. Yet compassion overrode her caution, and she stepped forward. Are you all right?" she asked softly, voice trembling in the cool air. She reached out and gently touched his shoulder. He flinched at first, as if he wasn't expecting any human contact. Then he lifted his gaze toward her. Under the single street lamp's yellowish glow, Cassidy could see tears streaming down a face contorted with anguish. He made a stifled, choked sound. I'm sorry," he said, though she wasn't sure why he was apologizing to her. She noticed his expensive-looking suit and the faint smell of cologne. His hair was slightly disheveled, as if he'd been tugging at it in distress. He might have been at a formal event earlier that day, but now his entire appearance suggested nothing but heartbreak. "Are you hurt?" she asked again, this time more gently. She crouched down to his eye level, ignoring the cold seeping through her jeans. She couldn't see any obvious wounds, but there was a vacant, haunted look in his eyes. He swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. "No, not physically," he managed, his voice breaking. I was left at the altar today." She walked out. Disappeared. "God, I've never felt so," his words dissolved into a new wave of sobs that racked his body. She noticed how his hands trembled, his fingers still showing faint signs of a ring mark where a band had likely been. Cassidy's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't fathom the shock of being abandoned on what was supposed to be the happiest day of one's life. Her heart twisted painfully in her chest, imagining the scene, a bride simply vanishing before the vows, leaving the groom to stand alone in front of bewildered guests. It was the sort of story that made headlines in the tabloids, and yet here he was, an actual person, devastated and alone in a miserable back alley. Before she could analyze the wisdom of her actions, Cassidy did something purely instinctive. She leaned in and wrapped her arms around him, gently pulling him into a hug. It was awkward at first, as though he didn't know how to accept comfort. His body went rigid, and she could sense his surprise. But then the tension gave way, and he clung to her like a drowning man grasping a life raft, burying his face into her shoulder. Rain began to sprinkle down, tiny droplets tapping against the nearby gutters. Neither of them moved away. She felt his breath hitch, his tears hot against her coat. Despite the chill in the air, Cassidy felt an unexpected warmth blossom in her chest, a surge of empathy and protectiveness for someone she'd never even met before this moment. Through ragged sobs, he tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. She just held him, letting him pour out whatever agony had consumed him. They stayed like that for what felt like minutes, or perhaps longer. The wind picked up, carrying the damp scent of coming rain deeper into the alley. At some point, Cassidy realized he was shivering, whether from the cold or his emotional state, she couldn't be sure. She loosened her arms and pulled back slightly so she could see his face, though he still kept his gaze down as if ashamed. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice raw. "I must look ridiculous." His cheeks flushed, and he wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand, avoiding her gaze. She shook her head firmly. "You don't. You've gone through something horrible. No one should judge you for being upset. A part of her wondered if she was saying the right thing, if there was more she could offer him. Do you have a place to go? Somewhere warm? A friend you could call? He swallowed hard. I don't know. My parents live a few states away. Everyone else was at the wedding, but after she ran, I just couldn't bear the pity in their eyes. So I left before anyone could stop me. I haven't been able to face any of them. She studied him, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the frayed edges of his suit jacket. How many hours had he been wandering around, aimless and heartbroken, before ending up here? Look, she said softly, I'm Cassidy. If you need help or just someone to listen, I can. He pushed himself upright and ran a shaky hand through his hair, as though trying to regain a measure of composure. Alaric Gray, he said, offering her a faint, sad smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Thank you, Cassidy. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't stopped. She glanced at the rain, which was coming down harder now. Let's at least get you out of this alley. Do you have money for a cab or a hotel? Somewhere you can stay tonight? Alaric hesitated, clearly torn between pride and desperation. I have some savings. Booked a hotel room earlier, but I never went inside. Just wandered, trying to clear my head. Couldn't do it, though. His eyes flicked away, filled with an overwhelming sense of loss. Maybe I should try again. She nodded. I'll walk you there, if it's nearby. I don't feel right leaving you alone like this. She braced herself for protest, but instead, he gave a subdued nod of agreement. They stepped out of the alley together, pace slow. The drizzle evolved into a steady downpour, and neither had an umbrella, but Cassidy stayed close. She kept her arm gently linked with his, not so much for romantic reasons but out of a desire to keep him from collapsing under the weight of his sorrow. As they approached a modest downtown hotel, she felt him stiffen, as though the bright neon sign overhead was somehow accusing him of his predicament. They paused under the awning at the entrance. Alaric stared at the glass doors, inside of which a night clerk sat at the reception desk with a tired look. Part of Cassidy wanted to offer him a place to stay herself, but she barely knew him, and she wasn't sure how safe or appropriate that would be. Yet a compulsion to help him still throbbed in her chest. Will you be okay? She asked, voice gentle. You can call me if you need to talk. He blinked, seeming to remember that the rest of the world still existed. Yeah, I think so. He fumbled for his phone, tapping her number into it. There was a moment of awkward silence, broken only by rain hammering the pavement. Finally, he forced a small, grateful smile. Cassidy, thank you. I owe you more than I can say. She gave his arm a reassuring squeeze. It's all right, she managed. She watched him walk through the hotel's glass doors, shoulders bowed like a man carrying twice his weight in regrets and heartbreak. Even after he disappeared inside, she lingered, trying to process the chance encounter. She had comforted a stranger who had just lost what he believed would be the beginning of his happily ever after. Shivering in the wet night, she realized her own heart was beating wildly, as if trying to grapple with something monumental and unplanned. Though she had done her best to console him, she sensed that whatever had happened that day was more complicated than just a simple runaway bride story. And in that fleeting moment of closeness, when he'd clung to her in the alley, she felt something shift within her, an awareness of how fragile life could be, and how sometimes, reaching out a hand to someone in pain could change both lives in ways impossible to predict. Cassidy woke up the next morning with a nagging sense of unease she couldn't quite name. Her mind kept drifting to the night before, the rain-soaked alley, the haunting look of heartbreak on Alaric Gray's face, the raw vulnerability she had witnessed when he clung to her like a drowning man. She had comforted him purely on instinct, but now that she'd had a chance to sleep on it, she wondered if she'd overstepped some invisible boundary. After all, they were little more than strangers, albeit strangers linked by an extraordinary circumstance. Over coffee in her modest apartment, Cassidy tried to push away the persistent thoughts. She had a column due by midday and spent the early hours polishing sentences, editing paragraphs, and hunting for the right angle to bring her piece to life. Yet every time she paused to gather her thoughts, memories of Alaric intruded. The article she was writing was supposed to be about local charities, but her focus kept veering to the image of him huddled in the rain, suit soaked, voice trembling with despair. By 10 o'clock, her concentration was all but gone. She found herself checking her phone repeatedly, not quite sure if she hoped or dreaded a call or text from him. He had taken her number last night, but would he actually use it? Maybe he'd woken up feeling mortified at the idea of contacting the woman who saw him at his absolute lowest. Or perhaps he genuinely wanted to stay in touch, even if only for the solace of having someone who knew the story behind his heartbreak. Cassidy took a deep breath, reminding herself that she had made no promises beyond a listening ear. Around noon, she finally submitted her column to her editor and decided to step out for lunch. The day was warmer, with bright sunlight reflecting off the wet pavement. She walked to a nearby cafe she often frequented, a tiny place with mismatched chairs, potted ferns in the window, and a chalkboard menu filled with daily specials. The moment she stepped inside, a familiar barista greeted her, and she ordered a simple sandwich and iced tea before retreating to a corner table. Usually, she enjoyed people watching or reading a book while she ate, but her mind was still spinning around Alaric and how abruptly fate had thrust them into each other's paths. Halfway through her meal, her phone buzzed. Her heart skipped an irrational beat. She wiped her hands on a napkin and grabbed her phone, seeing a text from an unknown number. Instinct whispered it had to be him. "Hi, Cassidy. It's Alaric. Thank you for last night. I know I was a mess. Could we meet? I'd like to properly thank you. Maybe around 2 p.m. if you're free." She felt relief and a jolt of nerves all at once. She quickly typed back a response, "I'm glad you reached out. Sure, let me know where." A reply came seconds later, giving the address of a small, nondescript park on the quieter side of downtown, a spot she knew well for its old oak trees and a pond with ducks. He suggested meeting by the central fountain, which was usually surrounded by benches. After finishing her lunch, Cassidy strolled down the few blocks that separated the cafe from the park. The air was damp from the previous night's rain but pleasantly warm, and a few patches of pale blue sky peeked through the drifting clouds. She spotted Alaric even before she reached the fountain. He was standing beneath a towering oak, hands in his pockets, gaze directed toward the rippling surface of the pond. He wore a fresh change of clothes, casual slacks and a button-down shirt, but carried the same subdued aura she had seen in the alley. When she approached, he turned and offered a small smile that still didn't quite erase the deep sadness in his eyes. "Thanks for coming," he said softly, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me again. Last night was, well, I wasn't at my best." Cassidy shook her head. "Don't apologize. You went through something awful. It's not like you set out to ruin my evening or anything." She gestured toward a nearby bench, and they walked together to sit down. Small clusters of people dotted the park, a mother watching her toddler chase pigeons, an older couple holding hands. A gentle breeze carried the scent of wet grass and the distant laughter of children on a playground. Alaric's hands were still trembling, though he tried to keep them steady on his knees. I know you said you'd be willing to listen if I needed to talk. Part of me is still in shock, I guess." He exhaled a shaky breath. "I haven't really told anyone what happened, at least not in detail. My parents tried calling, but I can't bring myself to face them. And most of my friends, they're mutual friends with the bride who never showed up." Cassidy gave him a sympathetic look. "I can't imagine how hard that must be, especially when everyone expects you to explain something you still don't fully understand." He nodded, his shoulders slumping as though a weight pressed down on him. "Exactly. The day started like a dream. I thought I was about to marry the love of my life. By midday, she was gone, and I was left alone in front of 100 guests with no idea why she ran. His throat bobbed with an audible swallow. I only remember walking out of the church, the tuxedo feeling too tight, like I couldn't breathe. Then I found myself wandering for hours until, his voice trailed off, but Cassidy filled in the silence with a gentle squeeze of his forearm. She thought back to that moment in the alley, remembering how instinctively she'd embraced him, how heartbreak radiated off him like heat from a dying fire. You're allowed to be angry or sad or confused, no one should expect you to just snap back into normal life, she said softly. But you're here, which means maybe you're trying to move forward. A ghost of a smile curved his lips. Trying. Failing miserably, but, yes. I guess meeting you was the one bright spot in all this. He laughed a little, the sound tinged with self-consciousness. That probably sounds cheesy, but it's the truth. She felt a warmth rise to her cheeks, uncertain what to say. I'm glad I could help in some way, she managed, her voice quieter than intended. They sat in reflective silence for a moment, a breeze rustling the leaves overhead. Then Alaric cleared his throat. I hate to impose, but I don't really have anyone else to talk to about this. Would you, maybe be willing to meet me again? Not necessarily to talk about the wedding. Just to get out of my head, I guess. Cassidy studied him. Despite his obvious pain, there was a sincere vulnerability in his expression, the kind that made her want to shield him from further hurt. But she also felt a tug of caution. They were still strangers who happened to meet under extraordinary circumstances, and the last thing she wanted was to give him false hope or entangle herself in a complicated rebound. Even so, she heard herself say, sure. I'm not exactly an expert on heartbreak, but I can be a friend. And she meant it. Perhaps it was the writer in her, drawn to uncovering the deeper layers of a story. Or maybe it was her empathic nature, the desire to help someone whose life had been turned upside down. In any case, she couldn't ignore that indescribable connection she felt, however fragile or fleeting it might be. His shoulders relaxed, relief evident on his face. Thank you, he said again, voice soft. A band of sunlight broke through the clouds, lighting up the park in gentle gold. They talked for a while longer, light conversation about their favorite cafes, a mention of the local art museum, and jokes about how the city's weather seemed to switch from rain to sunshine without warning. Finally, as the afternoon wore on, they rose from the bench. Alaric gave a small, wry laugh, as though remembering something. So, in the chaos of last night, I never actually thanked you properly for, well, hugging me in a dark alley. That's not exactly standard procedure for most people. Cassidy smiled, recalling how natural yet surreal it had felt. You looked like you needed it, she replied, hoping her tone conveyed the simple honesty behind her decision to step in. Sometimes life doesn't follow standard procedures. They parted ways with the promise to meet again soon. As Cassidy walked home, she couldn't stop replaying their conversation in her head. Yes, the situation was undeniably complicated. Helping a man through the immediate aftermath of being left at the altar was far from any reality she'd imagined for herself. Yet she sensed something profoundly authentic in his pain and in the tentative glimmers of hope he showed when he spoke with her. It made her want to be near him, if only to reassure him that not all things precious in life had to be so easily lost. By the time she arrived at her apartment, the clouds had drifted into a warm pastel sunset. She stared out her living room window, letting the sky's changing colors calm her. She wondered if she had just set foot on a path that might lead to deeper emotional involvement than she was ready for. But even as that thought sparked caution in her mind, an undercurrent of anticipation rippled in her chest. She had never been one to turn away from a chance to understand people, to be a steady presence for someone in pain, and Alaric, for all his wounded spirit, felt like someone she didn't want to abandon. That night, she found it impossible to concentrate on anything else. Her laptop remained shut as she cooked a simple dinner, and her usual bedtime routine of reading a few pages from a novel yielded no solace. Sleep arrived slowly, punctuated by vivid images of him standing alone at a church's steps or crying in the rain. Yet within those unsettling images, a softer, quieter hope glowed, the thought that their connection might be more than a fleeting intersection of circumstance, that perhaps they each had something the other was seeking, compassion, companionship, and the chance to believe in something new after all. Cassidy tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy in her routine over the next couple of days, but it proved difficult. A lingering curiosity, and a faint undercurrent of concern, kept drawing her thoughts back to Alaric Gray. She told herself that he was just another person experiencing heartbreak, and that her involvement should remain a supportive but casual connection. Yet whenever she found her mind drifting during work or before she fell asleep at night, he would be the first image that came to mind. It was equal parts disconcerting and strangely comforting. They had agreed to meet again, though neither had suggested a date or time. Cassidy busied herself drafting a new article for the paper about local artists. She spent a morning interviewing an eccentric painter who lived in a renovated barn on the outskirts of town, and though the interview went well, she found herself comparing his self-expression through art to Alaric's unspoken grief. The painter's vivid murals seemed like a visual representation of a wounded soul, splashed across bricks and wooden beams. And all day long, between taking notes and snapping photos, Cassidy questioned whether Alaric, too, had once been as vibrant as the person he might still become. That evening, she tried to unwind by meeting her friend Ava at a small wine bar downtown. Ava was another writer, albeit one focused on short stories and poetry rather than newspaper columns, and they often served as sounding boards for each other's creative blocks and personal dilemmas. As Cassidy slipped onto a tall stool next to her friend at the gleaming wooden counter, she realized how much she needed a moment of easy conversation. They each ordered a glass of Cabernet, and Ava immediately noticed Cassidy's restlessness. "You keep fidgeting," Ava teased gently, giving her a playful nudge. "Something's on your mind. Spill." Cassidy swirled the wine in her glass, watching the deep red legs coat the sides before she took a sip. "You remember I told you about that guy in the alley? The one who got left at the altar?" She kept her voice hushed, aware of how dramatic it sounded when summarized so bluntly. Ava's eyes widened. "The man you found crying in the rain? Of course I remember, how could I forget? You said you walked him to a hotel but had no idea if you'd ever hear from him again." Leaning on the bar, Cassidy recapped their impromptu meeting at the park, the timid smiles, the conversation about heartbreak, how he seemed stuck in the fog of his own misery yet determined not to succumb to it. She tried to stay objective, but her tone revealed a genuine warmth. "He wants to meet again, presumably to talk or just, not be alone. And I feel compelled to help him. But I also worry about crossing a line. He's clearly vulnerable, and I don't want to be some bandage for his pain only to have him regret it later." Ava mulled that over, tapping a finger against her chin. "It's a tricky situation," she admitted. "On the one hand, you're right, he's raw from heartbreak. On the other, he reached out to you. It's not like you're pushing yourself on him. Maybe it's just as simple as two people who happen to need each other's company for a while." Cassidy exhaled, grateful for her friend's pragmatic perspective. "I guess so. I just can't help feeling like my curiosity might turn into something more. And I'm not sure if that's fair to him or me." Ava gave a small shrug. "Feelings are rarely fair. Besides, you said he seems honest about his emotions. If he's asking for company, he probably just wants a genuine friend who won't judge him. In my experience, heartbreak can make a person crave two things, understanding and normalcy. You can offer him both, if you're careful." They let the conversation meander from Alaric to the topic of Ava's latest poetry submission, then circled back again to Cassidy's ambivalence. By the time they parted ways, the wine had soothed Cassidy's nerves, but her mind was still a jumble of questions without definitive answers. She walked home through quiet streets, hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket against a crisp breeze. While the city lights glowed in the distance, she tried to picture what Alaric's evening must be like. Was he holed up in a dim hotel room, replaying painful memories of a wedding that never happened? Or was he out there somewhere, trying to reconstruct the scattered pieces of his future? Early the next morning, just as Cassidy settled at her desk to outline a new article, her phone buzzed with a text. Seeing Alaric's name flash across the screen sent a prickle of anticipation through her. She unlocked the phone with a flick of her thumb. "Hey, Cassidy. I've been thinking about our conversation. There's a little place I found near the river, kind of a hidden cafe. Would you want to meet for coffee later?" She caught herself smiling, an involuntary reaction that warmed her chest. Her fingers hovered over the on-screen keyboard. After a second's hesitation, she typed back, "Sure. I'd love to try a new spot. Send me the address and a time." He responded almost immediately, providing directions to a converted boathouse cafe down by the water. He suggested noon, and she agreed, ignoring the flutter in her stomach that felt equal parts excitement and nerves. Work suddenly seemed like an obstacle to be cleared before she could see him again. When noon arrived, she navigated the winding path down to the river's edge, marveling that she had never known about this place. The small structure was perched on a wooden dock, its weathered planks leading out over the gently rippling current. A sign reading "Dockside Brew" hung from a chain by the entrance, and a few empty chairs clustered around low tables. The sun hovered overhead, reflecting on the water's surface, while seagulls drifted lazily across a bright sky. She spotted Alaric sitting at one of the outdoor tables, a mug already in his hand. He offered a hesitant wave when he caught sight of her. The subdued gratitude in his expression, like he was genuinely relieved she had shown up, made her heart tighten. She approached, noticing the tension in his posture and the shadows still present behind his polite smile. "I hope you like waterfront views," he greeted her softly. "I stumbled upon this place yesterday. Felt peaceful." Cassidy nodded, sinking into the chair across from him. "I love it. I can't believe I've never been here." A waitress appeared, and Cassidy ordered a cappuccino, inhaling the scent of fresh coffee that mingled with the briny smell of the river. For a while, they exchanged small talk, how her latest interview went, the surprising calm of the city on a weekday afternoon, even idle reflections on the weather. She sensed his nerves gradually untangling. Occasionally, his gaze wandered to the gentle waves lapping against the dock, as though the motion of the water soothed something raw inside him. After a lull in conversation, he set down his mug. "I've been asking myself over and over how everything went so wrong," he confessed, fingers curling around the table's edge. "I keep replaying the last few weeks before the wedding, trying to see if there were signs I ignored. I guess I should say my ex-fiancée, seemed stressed, but I chalked it up to normal wedding jitters. Turns out maybe she was on the verge of running and never said a word." Cassidy's chest tightened with empathy. "That's a lot to process. But please remember it's not all on you. If she was unhappy or afraid, she owed you honesty. Leaving you in that way was cruel." He swallowed hard, looking down at the table. "I know. I can't help wondering if something about me, my life, made her feel like it wouldn't work. She used to say I was too idealistic, that I wanted this perfect future we might never achieve. Or that I clung to certain traditions, which she said felt stifling." A mirthless laugh escaped him. "I guess I never thought she'd actually walk away 5 minutes before the ceremony." Cassidy reached across and covered his hand with hers, that familiar surge of protectiveness flooding back. "You can't blame yourself for everything. Her decision was ultimately her own. People make choices, sometimes selfishly. You couldn't have predicted it." His hand in hers felt tense, as though part of him still braced for more pain. Yet he didn't pull away. "I know you're right logically," he said, voice low. "But logic doesn't always help when your emotions are caught in this constant swirl. I'm torn between heartbreak and anger and relief, too, maybe. That if she was going to leave, it happened before we actually got married." Cassidy nodded, noting the faint bitterness that tinged his last words. "Relief is valid, though it doesn't make it easier, does it?" "No, not at all," he replied. A pensive silence settled between them, punctuated by the sound of waves against the dock. When their coffee cups ran dry, neither made a move to leave. The sun had grown stronger, and Cassidy felt warmth on her shoulders. She saw Alaric exhale slowly, as if summoning the nerve to say more. Then, with a small, self-conscious smile, he turned to her. "You said you write for a local paper," he asked, as though trying to veer the topic away from his pain. "What made you decide to do that?" Grateful for the shift, Cassidy brightened. She launched into a brief explanation of how she'd grown up devouring books, always scribbling short stories in her notebooks. When she'd moved to the city, she found a staff writer position at the newspaper, which evolved into columnist work. He asked questions about her favorite types of stories to cover and whether she felt the city had changed since she arrived. The sincerity of his interest put her at ease, and for the first time since they'd met, she witnessed a flicker of genuine curiosity that wasn't overshadowed by his misery. Eventually, the afternoon wore on, and the cafe began to fill with a smattering of other patrons seeking a midday caffeine fix. Alaric glanced at his phone, wincing slightly. "I have an appointment in an hour. I guess I should go." She nodded, though she couldn't deny a pang of regret. Sitting there with him, focusing on something beyond heartbreak, had felt oddly natural. "Of course. I probably should get back to work, too," she lied, knowing her schedule was actually flexible. But it seemed like the polite, unintrusive thing to say. He stood, smoothing invisible wrinkles from his shirt. "Thank you again, for listening," he murmured. "I feel like I keep saying that, but it's the only thing that fits." "I'm grateful." Cassidy rose as well, gathering her bag. "I'm happy to. I hope you'll keep letting me know if you need a friend." For a moment, he looked like he wanted to hug her again, as he had in the alley, but the casual setting held him back. Instead, he simply touched her shoulder in a gentle gesture of thanks, then walked with her to the edge of the dock. They lingered there in the sunlight, the sound of gulls overhead. Even with his sadness, there was a faint promise in his eyes, a promise of someone trying to rediscover who he was, perhaps even forging a new path. It occurred to Cassidy how delicate such a process could be, and she felt a strong urge to safeguard it. "I'll call you soon," he said, giving her that small, tremulous smile one last time. "Maybe we can do this again. Minus the heavy topics, or at least with fewer tears." She managed a soft chuckle. "Deal." He departed along the water's edge, head bowed in thought, while she walked in the opposite direction. Halfway back to the main street, she stopped to watch a boat drift by, letting her mind replay snatches of their conversation. Behind the heartbreak, beneath the layers of betrayal, she sensed a caring, earnest soul in Alaric, someone who had believed in love deeply enough to stand at an altar, only to have that belief nearly crushed. She wondered whether their tentative companionship could help him stitch together those fractured hopes. At the same time, she felt stirrings of her own heart, which she tried to quell. It was too soon to imagine anything resembling romance, and the last thing she wanted was to overstep. Yet as she made her way home, the comforting breeze ruffling her hair, she realized with a pang of excitement that she looked forward to seeing him again. In a short span of days, he had gone from a nameless, sobbing stranger to someone whose presence felt oddly vital. It was a fragile, uncertain connection, but it was real, and for now, that was enough. Cassidy's next few days drifted by with a curious blend of normal life and an undercurrent of unexpected anticipation. She dutifully tackled her newspaper assignments, met with a local sculptor for an upcoming arts feature, and even squeezed in a quick weekend trip to the farmer's market with her friend Ava. Yet through it all, her mind kept looping back to Alaric, recalling the vulnerable set of his shoulders as they talked about his ex, the relief that had softened his features when the conversation turned to lighter topics, and the way he gently touched her shoulder in gratitude before they parted. By the time Sunday afternoon rolled around, Cassidy realized she had been checking her phone more often than usual, half hoping for a message or a call from him. Rationally, she reminded herself that he had a right to his own pace. After all, he was still nursing deep wounds from a near wedding that never happened. And yet she couldn't deny the warm thrill that sparked each time she allowed herself to remember his smile or the way his eyes lit up, however briefly, when he spoke about discovering that hidden boathouse cafe. She wondered if it was healthy for her to be so invested in someone else's healing. But every time she tried to imagine pulling back, she felt an ache of reluctance, as if they were two threads slowly weaving together, and she feared breaking the pattern too soon. Late that evening, while she was in the middle of writing notes for her next article, her phone buzzed. Alaric's name glowed on the screen, sending her pulse racing. She carefully saved her work before picking up, forcing herself to sound more casual than she felt. "Hey," he said, a hint of uncertainty in his tone. "I hope I'm not calling too late." "Not at all," she replied, setting aside her notepad. "I'm still awake." "Everything okay?" A soft exhale came through the line. "Yeah. He paused, as if searching for the right words. "I was thinking about heading to an event tomorrow, a garden exhibit at the local conservatory. I know it might sound random, but I remember you saying you like plants and flowers. Wanted to see if you'd be interested in going with me. There'll be local growers, horticulture talks, and, well, I could use the distraction." Cassidy felt her heart expand with a mixture of relief and excitement. "I do love flowers," she said, her voice carrying a smile. "I've heard about that exhibit but never had the chance to visit. I'm game if you are." They set a time to meet the next day in front of the conservatory's glass-paneled entrance. After they hung up, Cassidy allowed herself a moment of indulgent giddiness. It struck her that she was no longer merely offering comfort, she was sharing in something he genuinely wanted to do. Maybe it was a small step, but it felt significant, like a door opening to a new kind of connection between them. The following afternoon was bright and sunny, a departure from the recent rainstorms. Cassidy arrived at the conservatory a few minutes early, wearing a light jacket despite the warmth in the air. The building itself was a marvel, arched glass ceilings that captured the light, tall windows revealing lush greenery within. She spotted Alaric waiting near a sculpture of a hummingbird, looking far less haggard than he had during their first encounter. Though traces of sadness still lingered in his eyes, his posture seemed steadier, more present. They greeted each other with smiles. Then, with tickets in hand, they entered the exhibit. Immediately, they were greeted by an explosion of color, hundreds of orchids hanging from wire frames, vibrant succulents arranged in intricate patterns, and exotic lilies that perfumed the air. Soft classical music played from hidden speakers, creating an atmosphere both dreamy and serene. Alaric walked beside her at a leisurely pace, occasionally stopping to admire a unique flower or read the little information plaques. At one display of bright orange blossoms, he hesitated, pressing his lips together. "It's funny," he remarked, voice low, "how I never really took the time to appreciate things like this before. I was always rushing, meetings, errands, wedding plans. Now that I have nothing but time, I'm noticing the details I used to overlook." Cassidy nodded, lightly brushing her fingertips over a nearby leaf. "Sometimes that's how healing starts. You learn to see what you missed when you were stuck in old routines." He let out a faint chuckle. "You say that like you've been through your own heartbreak." She hesitated, not because she lacked stories, but because her heartbreaks felt small compared to the magnitude of his. Yet honesty felt necessary. "I've had failed relationships," she confessed. "Nothing as dramatic as being left at the altar, but enough to know heartbreak. Enough to understand the sense of everything I planned just vanished, that you must be feeling." His gaze softened with empathy. "I'm sorry you've had to feel that," he said softly, surprising her with how genuine the concern in his voice sounded. They let the silence hold for a moment, a gentle, mutual recognition that pain came in many shapes. The tension eased as they moved on to the next section, which showcased carnivorous plants. They shared fascinated horror at the sticky tendrils and hinged traps, imagining the tiny insects these plants ensnared. It was a bizarre yet strangely fun detour, and they found themselves laughing, truly laughing, in a way that felt unguarded, unweighted by tragedy. That shared humor seemed to crack open another layer of trust between them. After nearly an hour exploring the indoor gardens, they emerged into a courtyard overflowing with roses. Sunlight glinted off fountains scattered throughout the garden paths. Cassidy paused by a climbing rose vine, inhaling its sweet scent, while Alaric leaned in to see the small name tag. Crown Princess Margarita, he read with a wry smile. I guess roses are fancy like that. She giggled, stepping closer to him. Their arms brushed lightly, and a subtle warmth shot through her. It felt like a moment that could tilt into something more intimate, but neither of them spoke. Instead, they turned to walk among the rows of roses, content in each other's presence. They eventually left the conservatory with pamphlets in hand and remnants of floral fragrances clinging to their clothes. Outside, a late afternoon breeze carried the faint hum of traffic from the streets nearby. Alaric glanced at her with a mixture of gratitude and shyness. Thanks for coming with me. I know it's just a garden exhibit, but I feel lighter now, if that makes sense. Cassidy offered a smile that reached her eyes. It does. I'm glad I could share it with you. A flicker of boldness stirred inside her, maybe it was the sunlight or the lingering scent of roses, but she found herself wanting to prolong their time together. Are you hungry? There's a cafe not far from here that has amazing pastries. He looked momentarily taken aback, though not displeased. Pastries sound incredible, actually. Then his expression shifted, as if he were momentarily recalling a heavier thought. Let me treat you this time, if that's okay. It would be nice to do something for someone else instead of feeling like I'm always taking. She touched his arm in a gentle reassurance. You're not just taking. But sure, if treating me to a pastry will make you feel better about it, I won't stop you. They shared a light laugh, the intimacy between them growing in small, significant ways. As they headed down the sidewalk side by side, Cassidy couldn't ignore the delicate hope blooming in her chest. She felt a sense of discovery in every word they exchanged, as though the cracks in Alaric's heart were aligning with her own hidden vulnerabilities. More than that, she sensed an unspoken understanding, neither of them was fixed, and perhaps they didn't have to be. Maybe, through shared laughter and gentle honesty, they were forging a path beyond the rubble of broken plans and unfulfilled promises. Only time would tell how sturdy that path could become, but for now, the possibility felt bright and real, as comforting as the memory of those fragrant roses under the midday sun. Cassidy could hardly remember a time when her days felt so saturated with possibility. She continued to work on her newspaper columns, carefully juggling interviews and research, but she found herself increasingly distracted by thoughts of Alaric. Their shared moments, wandering through rows of blooms at the conservatory, sipping coffee at the boathouse cafe, loomed in her mind like bright snapshots she couldn't stop revisiting. She'd catch herself smiling for no reason, an involuntary reaction that made her both hopeful and nervous. Late one afternoon, she wrapped up an interview with a local chef who was opening a new restaurant. On her way back to the newspaper's office, her phone vibrated, and she paused in the hallway to check her messages. It was from Alaric, a short note asking if she was free that evening. He'd found a nighttime street market, one of those spontaneous events where artisans and food trucks gathered, bringing the sidewalks to life with color and music. She felt a warm rush of excitement at the thought of exploring a bustling crowd with him. Within minutes, she texted back a quick yes, setting a time and place to meet. When she arrived at the market, the sky had dimmed to a deep indigo, and strings of fairy lights blinked overhead. Lively chatter mingled with the scent of sizzling street food, while a guitarist somewhere nearby played an upbeat tune that drifted through the rows of stalls. Cassidy spotted Alaric near a handmade pottery booth, his figure outlined by a cluster of hanging bulbs. He waved as she approached, and her heart flipped a little at the genuine warmth in his smile. They started down the main thoroughfare, stopping every few steps to admire a stall featuring handcrafted candles or to sample bites of food from vendors hawking international cuisines. A man juggling flaming torches drew a small crowd, and they paused to watch, laughing as the performer delivered a dramatic finale. Despite her outward cheer, Cassidy couldn't help noticing a hint of wistfulness in Alaric's eyes whenever they passed a stall showcasing wedding decorations or custom invitations. She found herself edging closer to him, gently nudging his arm in silent support. Eventually, They ended up at a food truck serving gourmet grilled cheese sandwiches, the air around it thick with the aroma of melted cheddar and fresh bread. They decided to indulge, perching on a low stone wall while they devoured their gooey meals. For a while, they mostly talked about trivial things, the odd talents of the street performers, Cassidy's recent newspaper piece, the unexpected satisfaction of a well-made grilled cheese. But as they finished eating, a quieter moment settled over them. She noticed him staring down at his half-empty soda cup, his brows knitting together. He let out a small sigh and glanced at her. It's weird, isn't it, to feel happy in one moment and then suddenly guilty about it the next? Like I'm betraying the grief I should be holding on to. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. The subtle tension she felt there reminded her that his heartache was never far below the surface. I don't think feeling happy means you've forgotten what happened, she said carefully. You can still honor the hurt you went through and make room for new joy. Healing doesn't have to be a betrayal. He blew out a breath that seemed to carry some of his anxiety with it. I appreciate you saying that. Sometimes I just feel so tangled. If I'm laughing or enjoying myself, I wonder if I'm moving too fast, if I'm not giving myself enough time to grieve everything I lost. Cassidy considered her words before responding. I can't pretend to know the exact right timing for you. But I do know that life never follows a neat schedule. We get thrown into chaos, and sometimes the best thing we can do is let happiness in when it shows up, even if it feels sudden. He nodded, searching her expression as though committing her face to memory. There was a vulnerability there that made her want to fold him into a hug right then and there, but she sensed he was holding himself together with delicate effort. Instead, she moved her hand to his wrist and gave a reassuring squeeze. They shared a soft, almost shy smile, then continued strolling deeper into the market. They wandered past stalls of homemade jewelry, rummaged through bins of vintage vinyl records, and sampled sweet pastries dusted with cinnamon sugar. Every so often, someone selling ornate calligraphy fonts or wedding-themed decorations caught Alaric's eye, and Cassidy would watch a flicker of complicated emotion pass across his features. But he didn't shy away from it. He lingered to look, not in masochistic self-torment but as if reminding himself that the world hadn't ended simply because one wedding had fallen apart. The resilience she saw in him, tentative though it was, flooded her with admiration. Eventually, the market began to wind down. Vendors packed up unsold goods, and the bright string lights seemed to lose a bit of their luster. Alaric and Cassidy found themselves back at the edge of the street, where fewer people roamed. They stood near a lamppost that flickered intermittently, casting irregular shadows across the pavement. A hush fell between them, not awkward but pensive. He inhaled sharply, then finally turned to face her. I want to thank you, he said in a quiet voice that carried more weight than casual gratitude. Every time we meet, I feel less locked inside my own head. You don't push me to forget what happened, but you don't let me wallow, either. Her throat constricted with unexpected emotion. I'm really glad I can help, but it's not one-sided, you know. I value your company, too. She forced a small smile. I was starting to think I'd forgotten how to really connect with someone in a way that mattered. They moved a step closer, the space between them charged with something that felt both fragile and electric. She could see in his expression the echo of the man she'd first met in the rain, shattered and alone, and she could see the man he was learning to become, a man who dared to hope, if only a little. For a second, she wondered if he might lean in and kiss her, but he caught himself, perhaps recalling the swirl of mixed emotions they'd been discussing. Instead, he gently tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear in a gesture so tender it made her pulse pound. In that charged silence, the world around them seemed to recede, the last remnants of the market, the occasional car rolling by. Cassidy felt an acute awareness of how deeply she cared for him already, and how complicated it could become if they let things develop too quickly. Yet there was a quiet thrill in that realization, a recognition that sometimes the best experiences in life are the ones that arrive without premeditated planning, the ones that evolve in the wake of adversity. Shall I walk you home? He asked, voice a notch above a whisper. She nodded, relieved that the offer gave them a chance to linger in each other's presence a bit longer. Together they set off, his hand hovering near hers, neither quite brave enough to clasp fingers openly just yet. Despite the swirl of unspoken feelings, the companionship they shared was comforting in its own right. By the time they reached her doorstep, a gentle breeze carried the promise of nightfall, and the distant glow of streetlights framed them in muted gold. He bid her good night with a quiet sincerity, a grateful look in his eyes that made her heart skip. She watched him walk away, a complex combination of calm and longing weaving through her thoughts. Later, alone in her apartment, she replayed the evening in her mind. She could still feel the soft pressure of his hand against her wrist, the warmth of his breath when he spoke, the flicker of longing in his gaze. Though they hadn't titled what was growing between them, she sensed it stretching beyond mere friendship, fueled by compassion and a shared desire to find hope in the wake of disappointment. She knew they were treading on fragile ground, yet somehow that fragility felt honest, a gentle reminder that sometimes the most beautiful things in life were also the most delicate. Cassidy woke the next morning with a flutter in her stomach, a strange blend of anticipation and quiet concern lingering from the previous night. She replayed images of Alaric in her mind, the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her, the subtleties of his posture that suggested he was trying to trust himself and her a bit more each day. She also remembered the fleeting guilt he'd expressed, how happiness felt like a betrayal to the grief he was supposed to feel. The thought that he might still be wrestling with those emotions caused her chest to tighten, and she resolved not to push him in any direction he wasn't ready to go. Work deadlines kept her busy for much of the day. She was finalizing a piece on a local fundraiser that involved rescue animals and a pop-up adoption event. She interviewed participants over the phone and tried to write in a way that captured not just the logistical details but the emotional essence behind the event, hoping to inspire readers. By early afternoon, she'd sent her draft to her editor, then treated herself to a quick walk around the block. She found her mind wandering to Alaric yet again, speculating on how he was spending his day. Was he at work? She realized she knew very little about his actual profession or if he'd taken time off to cope with everything that had happened. Their conversations had skimmed the surface of everyday life, but mostly they revolved around his healing and the tentative connection growing between them. Back at her desk, she checked her phone and saw a missed call. Her pulse soared when she recognized Alaric's number. He'd left a voicemail, his voice hesitant yet clear through the tinny speaker when she played it back. He mentioned he was wandering the city, trying to sort out paperwork that still lingered from the cancelled wedding. It sounded as though he'd run into unexpected issues, possibly with vendors or deposits that needed returning. The frustration in his tone tugged at her heart. He said he might need to talk and would call again later, hoping to catch her at a better time. She texted him immediately, telling him she was free anytime after 4. The rest of her afternoon crawled by, every minute on the clock feeling unreasonably long. She alternated between rereading her latest article and glancing at her phone, attempting to play it cool even though she was far from calm. It startled her how deeply she cared about his well-being after such a short time, but she couldn't deny it. His pain was real, and it felt as though every gentle step forward he took belonged, in a small way, to them both. Around 5, a message finally lit up her screen. Could we meet at your place? I'm near your neighborhood and didn't want to drag you out if you're busy. I won't stay long if you have other plans. She stared at the text for a moment, butterflies stirring in her stomach. The notion of him stepping into her personal space felt intimate, more so than wandering a park or browsing a street market together. It felt like a threshold, and she wondered if she was ready to cross it. Yet her heart soared with the opportunity to be there for him, to invite him into her daily reality. She tapped out a response, telling him to come by in half an hour, then rushed home to do a quick tidy of her living area, anxiety simmering in the background. He arrived at her door looking winded, as though he'd walked in a hurry. She noticed a tension in his shoulders, a crease between his brows. After a moment's hesitation, he managed a smile that didn't quite chase away the shadows in his eyes. She welcomed him in, feeling relief mixed with uncertainty. He offered a soft compliment on her apartment, scanning the bookshelves and the little potted plants on the windowsill, then he sank onto the couch with a sigh. She made them both tea in her small kitchen nook, waiting for the water to boil while he sat in silence. Occasionally, she caught him glancing toward her with a thoughtful expression, as though searching for the right words. Finally, steaming mugs in hand, she joined him on the couch. She asked if everything was all right, and for a few seconds, he didn't answer. He admitted he'd spent the morning making calls and canceling the last remnants of wedding arrangements, claiming back whatever deposits he could. He mentioned how stressful it was to relive the details of a celebration that had never taken place, choosing invitations, the menu, the floral arrangements, all these decisions he'd once made joyfully, believing he was building a future with the woman he loved. Each phone call felt like tearing open a wound that had barely started to scab over. He told her he felt raw, exhausted by the conversations, as if each vendor's sympathetic tone only magnified his own humiliation. She listened intently, setting her mug aside so she could lay a comforting hand on his arm. The quiet anger she felt, anger for what he'd been forced to endure and for the way his ex had left him to shoulder the fallout, nearly overwhelmed her. She bit her tongue, though, not wanting to stoke his bitterness. Instead, she told him she respected how bravely he was tackling these final, painful tasks. He shrugged, as though uncertain he deserved praise for doing what had to be done. In a sudden burst of vulnerability, he asked about her past again. He wanted to understand why she seemed so at ease with his emotional turmoil, how she managed to treat him kindly without making him feel like a pity case. She confessed that while she had never been abandoned at the altar, she knew the sting of rejection and unfulfilled promises. She recounted a relationship from a few years back where someone she truly loved had slowly drifted away, never giving her a direct reason, leaving her with a gnawing sense of inadequacy. She told him that heartbreak had taught her empathy. She remembered how lonely it felt to suffer in silence, how much she'd wished for a friend who wouldn't try to fix everything but would simply be there. He looked at her with profound gratitude etched into his features. There was something quiet and searching in his expression, as though he saw her not just as a kind soul but as a person with her own bruises and cracks in need of recognition. Without warning, he leaned toward her and rested his forehead against her shoulder. She froze for half a heartbeat, not in fear but in awe of the fragile trust he placed in her. Then she exhaled softly and wrapped her arms around him, holding him as she had that very first night in the alley, only this time, they knew each other. They'd shared coffee and laughter, gentle walks and confessions. This was different, it was a deliberate, mutual surrender to a moment of solace. They sat there for a long time, his breath gradually slowing, tension seeping out of his rigid posture. When he finally spoke again, it was in a hushed tone against her hair. He whispered that the pain was still there, a dull ache at the center of his chest, but it felt less crushing because he didn't have to face it alone. She felt her throat tighten with emotion. She told him that she was here, and he didn't need to apologize for his brokenness. Afterward, he pulled away, cheeks slightly colored, as though shy about how intimate their closeness had been. She offered him a reassuring smile and shifted the conversation to lighter ground, favorite books, funny childhood memories, silly anecdotes from her interviews at the newspaper, and soon she had coaxed a tentative laugh out of him. The tension in the room lifted. They finished their tea, and Cassidy felt a peaceful warmth in her chest, some intuitive sense that they'd passed an important milestone. It was a moment that went beyond the shock of their initial meeting in the alley. Now they were forging a connection that neither had fully anticipated, and it was laced with the prospect of deeper feelings. He stayed a while longer, and they talked about unrelated topics, traveling, hidden spots in the city, the best hole-in-the-wall cafe he swore he'd discovered. By the time he glanced at the clock and realized he should go, they were both smiling easily, the earlier heaviness tempered by companionship. She walked him to the door, her heart pounding a little as he paused on the threshold. There was a fleeting second where she sensed he might lean in for a kiss, but instead, he grazed his thumb against her cheek in a gesture so tender it made her breath hitch. He whispered his thanks once again, this time for opening her home to him, for letting him lean on her, literally and figuratively, when he needed someone most. Her chest felt tight with unnamed emotion, and she couldn't force any articulate words out beyond a soft good night. As she locked the door behind him, Cassidy stood in the quiet hallway of her apartment, reflecting on how drastically her life had changed in the span of a couple weeks. She had gone from a solitary, somewhat guarded woman to a steady presence in someone's life, someone who had been left broken and was slowly finding his way back to hope. She wasn't naive enough to believe the path ahead would be easy for either of them. Still, in that moment, warmth filled her, banishing any lingering doubts. Whatever was unfolding between them was real, raw, and just fragile enough to be worth the risk. She vowed she would handle it with the care it deserved, hoping he would do the same. A few days passed in a serene haze, each one feeling like a small step closer to something that neither Cassidy nor Alaric had quite defined but could both sense. Their evenings often ended with late-night phone calls or impromptu walks through quiet neighborhoods. On more than one occasion, they found themselves sitting in a parked car or on a deserted bench, talking so earnestly they forgot the time. Each conversation revealed some new facet of who they were behind their respective walls, he a man learning to mend in the wake of public heartbreak, she a woman rediscovering her capacity to nurture another soul. Yet beneath the warmth of their growing bond, Cassidy occasionally caught undercurrents of tension in Alaric's eyes. She suspected it had to do with unresolved pieces of his past. He had mentioned once that his family lived out of state, but he rarely spoke about them, except to say that they were worried. He hadn't visited them since the cancelled wedding, reluctant to face their disappointment or pity. And despite the way he now opened up to Cassidy, she knew there were pockets of pain he still kept sealed, as if speaking them aloud would shatter his fragile progress. One afternoon, as Cassidy wrapped up her deadlines at the newspaper office, her phone vibrated. The message was from Alaric. "Any chance you can meet me at the park near downtown? There's something I need to figure out, and I'm not sure how to do it alone." She felt a pang of apprehension. The words sounded troubled, but not hopeless. Gathering her bag and wishing her editor a quick goodbye, she hurried outside, her thoughts racing with what might be weighing on him. She arrived at the park to find him sitting on a bench beneath a towering maple tree. The green canopy dappled sunlight across his features, but even in the gentle glow, she could see the unease etched into his brow. When he caught sight of her, his shoulders sagged with relief. She sat down beside him, close enough that their knees almost touched, and asked what was wrong. He pulled out his phone and opened a series of messages, handing it to her. Cassidy scanned them quickly, frowning at the increasingly urgent tone. They were from his parents and, to her surprise, his ex-fiancée's family as well, mostly unread, some partially responded to, each brimming with unspoken tension. His parents wanted him to come home for a belated, family discussion, while someone from his ex's side had apparently reached out, asking to settle any shared financial matters related to the would-be wedding. Cassidy felt her jaw tighten at the implication. After all this time, these unresolved threads were demanding attention, and Alaric seemed cornered by all sides. "I haven't told them anything," he admitted, taking the phone back with a shaky breath. "I don't know what to say. My parents want me to pretend everything's fine, or at least come home so they can fuss over me. And her relatives, well, they aren't unkind, but it's all so tangled. I thought I'd handled the cancellations, but apparently there's more I owe them or they owe me. I feel like no matter how far I run, I can't escape this." Cassidy placed a hand gently on his shoulder, feeling the tension in his muscles. "You've done so much to move forward, but maybe this last bit has to be faced head-on. Sometimes closure doesn't come from ignoring the problem." He stared at the grass for a long moment. "I think that's what scares me the most. Closure means admitting it all really happened, that I was left standing there, humiliated. I've been healing, yes, but maybe part of me hoped I could just bury it." She exhaled softly, choosing her words with care. "You're allowed to grieve how it ended. But dealing with it openly, no matter how painful, might free you from the last chains tying you to that moment at the altar." She paused, heart clenching at the vulnerability in his gaze. "Have you considered going to see your parents, maybe just for a short visit? Or writing to them to explain your side?" Alaric's mouth twisted wryly. "They mean well, but they've always had high expectations for me: career, social standing, the perfect marriage. Even if they don't say, "I told you so," I'll see it in their eyes. And as for her family, I don't know if I can look them in the face without feeling resentful, even though she's the one who chose to leave. For a while, they sat in silence, the park sounds weaving around them, the distant laughter of children, the crunch of gravel underfoot as joggers passed by, the rustle of leaves overhead. Cassidy sensed the tremor in his breathing, the push and pull between fear and the desire to finally close this chapter. She reached out, took his hand, and laced her fingers through his in a gesture that felt as natural as breathing. "I'll be with you, no matter what you decide," she said quietly. "If you need someone beside you, I'll go. If you need to handle it alone, I'll support that, too. But I do think you'll feel lighter once you confront them." He squeezed her hand, then turned his head to look at her, eyes warm with unshed gratitude. "You really would come with me to meet my parents, if that's what I decided?" She nodded, heart thudding a little at the thought. Meeting family, especially under such circumstances, was no small step. But she felt that fierce protective urge rise in her again, recalling how she'd first seen him broken in the alley, how they'd grown closer with each late-night talk and gentle reassurance. "If that helps you find peace, yes. I don't want you to go through this alone." He swallowed hard, torn between embarrassment and relief. Thank you," he managed. "It might come to that, but let me think on it. Maybe I need a day or two to figure out exactly what I want to say. And I don't want to drag you into family drama if it can be avoided." Gently, she teased out a smile from him. "So that means if it can't be avoided, I'll be at your side, right?" A breath of a chuckle escaped him. "Something like that." A flicker of lightness returned to his eyes. You're more than I ever expected to find, especially after everything fell apart." She felt a rush of heat color her cheeks. The words felt close to an admission of deeper feelings, and for a moment, her chest tightened with longing. She wanted to reassure him that she wasn't afraid, that his burdens didn't scare her away, but she also recognized how easily the intensity of this bond could overwhelm them both if they weren't careful. So instead, she rested her head on his shoulder, letting their quiet companionship do the talking. They remained that way for a while, watching the sun dip lower in the sky. Eventually, they rose from the bench and made their way out of the park, arms occasionally bumping, fingers still loosely entwined. A few people glanced at them as they passed, likely taking them for any other couple strolling at dusk. In a sense, they were two people drawn together by fate's strange hand, trying to navigate the shadowy spaces between heartbreak and hope. Outside the gate, they paused. Traffic hummed along the nearby street, and golden light spilled from a row of boutique storefronts. Alaric glanced at Cassidy, a mixture of nerves and resolution tightening his expression. "Would you come back to my place for dinner?" he asked, almost shyly. "I've been staying in a small rental apartment, but it has a decent kitchen. We could talk more, or we could just cook something mindless and watch a silly show." Her heart fluttered, and she offered him a warm smile. "I'd love that." They hailed a rideshare, the short drive passing in near silence, though he kept her hand in his the entire way. She didn't ask if his place held memories of the wedding that never was, she suspected it might. Instead, she let him lead her through the lobby of a modest building, up a set of stairs to a second-floor apartment. It was sparse but neat, a couch and coffee table, a small dining area, and boxes she guessed he'd never fully unpacked after everything fell through. He threw her an apologetic look over his shoulder. "Never got around to decorating, really." Cassidy's gaze flickered over the bare walls, the stack of half-open boxes that might have once contained wedding gifts. "It's fine," she said softly, stepping further in. "This is your space, no matter how temporary." He exhaled, nodding. "Right. It's home, for now." The evening light through the window cast shadows across the room, and while Alaric rummaged in the kitchen for ingredients, Cassidy took a moment to browse the titles of a few books stacked on a lone shelf, travel guides, a worn copy of a classic novel, and, to her surprise, a dog-eared photography collection. She smiled, thinking how little she still knew about his interests, and how much she wanted to discover. They ended up making a simple pasta dish, moving carefully around each other in the narrow space. He poked fun at her for adding too many spices, while she teased him about not knowing how to dice onions without tearing up. The playful banter felt like a welcome break from the tension that had weighed on them in the park. By the time they sat down at the small dining table, steaming plates in front of them, a sense of cozy intimacy had settled in the apartment. They clinked water glasses as if in a gentle toast to the moment. Dinner conversation meandered from random childhood memories to half-formed dreams for the future. He spoke in vague terms about wanting to travel or maybe move somewhere new, far from the ghosts of his nearly had wedding. She confessed that she'd longed, at one point, to write a novel instead of just columns, but had never found the courage to start. They were talking about ambition and fear, how the two often tangled together, when a sudden hush took over. She met his eyes across the table, and in that unguarded moment, she felt a quiet certainty. She wanted him to heal not just for himself, but because she believed in the possibility of something lasting between them. He must have sensed the shift, because he reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "I have no idea what tomorrow will look like," he said quietly, "but I know that today, I feel better because you're here." The raw honesty in his voice stirred a wave of emotion in her chest, and she found herself squeezing his hand in response, a silent affirmation that she was equally grateful. After dinner, they washed dishes side by side, laughing at how cramped the sink area was. The simple task felt oddly intimate. She wiped down the counters while he put the dishes away, an unspoken rhythm forming between them. By the time they finally settled on the couch, the day's earlier heaviness had receded into a calm acceptance. She leaned against him, and he looped an arm around her shoulders, pressing the faintest kiss to her temple. They turned on a streaming service, searching for a light-hearted show to end the evening with. Though they made jokes about focusing on the program, Cassidy found that neither of them truly cared what was on screen. She was aware of his heartbeat under her cheek, the reassuring weight of his arm, the soft sound of his breathing. For a fleeting second, she recalled that first encounter in the alley, how broken he'd looked. It struck her just how far they had come, and yet how much more they still had to face. At some point, they must have dozed off, because she awoke to find the TV still droning quietly. Her neck had a slight crick from resting on his shoulder for so long, but she felt no urge to move. The light from a nearby lamp cast a warm glow on Alaric's peaceful face, his breath slow and even in sleep. She watched him for a moment, her chest tightening at the tenderness that welled up inside her. This quiet interlude felt precious, more fragile than any glass figurine. She wanted it to last, even knowing life would inevitably stir conflict and complications. But for now, they had each other, two people bound by an encounter in a dim alley, now creating small moments of grace and, perhaps, something that might grow into real love. She closed her eyes again, hoping that when morning came, they'd still be in this place of calm, ready to face whatever ghosts were waiting just outside the door. Cassidy woke slowly to the soft glow of early morning drifting in through the half-drawn curtains. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The couch beneath her was unfamiliar, and the quiet warmth pressed against her shoulder didn't feel like a pillow. Then it all came back in a gentle rush: Alaric's apartment, the lingering aromas of last night's makeshift pasta dinner, the low hum of the TV they had left on by accident. She shifted slightly, feeling a reassuring pressure around her waist, his arm, still looped protectively around her. Her heart fluttered at the realization that they had fallen asleep together, more at peace than either of them could have predicted when they first met. She turned her head, finding Alaric gazing at her with a drowsy, affectionate look. A faint smile curved his lips. "Morning," he said, voice husky from sleep. "Morning," she murmured, glancing around. The screensaver on the TV was cycling through muted colors, and a layer of soft light seeped through the window, illuminating the scattered boxes and sparse furniture in the apartment. They must have barely moved all night. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke, content to soak in the moment. Cassidy felt the slow beat of his heart under her palm, and a gentle stirring of hope spread through her chest. She recalled how far they'd come from that stormy evening, when she found him in an alley, sobbing from an unspeakable betrayal. Now he was here, breathing steadily beside her, a man broken but not defeated, learning how to let the shards of his old life shape a new beginning. Eventually, Alaric yawned, sat up, and ran a hand through his rumpled hair, chuckling as he stretched. "Didn't think we'd end up having a sleepover on the couch," he said, sounding only mildly sheepish. Cassidy pushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear, laughing softly. "I guess we're both better at comforting each other than planning practical sleeping arrangements." She felt a pleasant tingle of closeness that overshadowed any embarrassment. He stood and offered her a hand. "I'll make us some coffee, if you don't mind instant. Still haven't stocked anything fancy." She accepted his hand, rising to her feet, and followed him into the small kitchen. The morning light revealed the lines of fatigue still faintly visible on his face, but there was also a looseness in his posture she hadn't seen before, a sense that he was growing more comfortable, that healing had become a choice rather than an obligation. While he busied himself with the kettle and spoons, Cassidy perched on a stool at the kitchen counter, gaze wandering to the stack of unopened boxes. She couldn't help thinking of the turmoil that still awaited him, unfinished conversations with his family, the need to finalize whatever paperwork or money exchange lingered with his ex's relatives. But instead of dread, she felt a gentle determination. Maybe it wouldn't be easy, but she believed in him, believed that he could face those ghosts. Alaric handed her a steaming mug, then slid onto the stool beside her. They sipped the coffee in companionable silence for a few minutes, until finally he spoke. "I did some thinking last night, well, this morning, actually. Couldn't really sleep." Her stomach flipped with cautious anticipation. "About?" He exhaled, cradling the mug in both hands. "I think I need to make that trip to see my parents, sooner rather than later. Talk everything out instead of letting it fester. And there's that money her family keeps mentioning. I hate the idea of calling them, but it's time to settle it, one way or another." She nodded, feeling a swell of pride at his resolve. "I'm glad you've decided. You'll feel freer once it's done, even if it's uncomfortable in the moment." His eyes flicked to hers. "You still willing to come along? I mean, I don't expect you to stand guard while I argue with everyone, but just having you nearby would help." She smiled softly, covering his hand with hers. "Of course I'll go with you, if that's what you want. I'm not going to let you do this alone." He closed his eyes for a beat, relief and emotion washing over his face. Then, with a renewed sense of determination, he set down his mug. "Okay. Then let me make a few calls today. We'll figure out a time to drive out there, maybe tomorrow or the day after." She squeezed his hand and moved her stool closer, leaning her shoulder against his. The soft morning quiet felt like a lullaby to all the worries banging on the walls of his mind. She let him rest, understanding how much it took for him to say the words out loud. By afternoon, he had arranged a date for his visit with his parents, as well as a call with his ex's family to discuss the final financial details. The day passed in a blur of phone calls, tense negotiations, and a few polite but strained apologies. Cassidy stood by, offering support and stepping aside when necessary, letting him navigate this last piece of unfinished business. He emerged from each conversation appearing drained but oddly lighter, as if each phone call stripped away one more remnant of guilt and shame. That evening, after finishing her own writing deadlines, Cassidy accompanied Alaric to a small diner near the edge of town. The neon sign buzzed overhead as they slipped into a vinyl booth, ordering burgers and milkshakes. It felt like a deliberate choice, something comfortingly ordinary after a day filled with emotional upheaval. Over the meal, they shared relieved smiles, occasionally exchanging anecdotes about the simplest things, funny headlines she'd written, a quirky neighbor he'd noticed in his building. Amid the casual banter, though, something important seemed to shift. They weren't just two people bound by sympathy and chance anymore. The closeness between them pulsed with a deeper resonance, quiet touches under the table, a glimmer in his gaze that spoke of more than gratitude. When they returned to his apartment, he placed a hesitant hand on her waist as she shed her light jacket. She turned to face him, heart hammering in her chest, sensing a moment of unspoken admission. His eyes sought hers with a question she couldn't yet phrase, but the intention felt obvious: are we ready to label what's forming between us? She answered him in the simplest way possible, rising on her toes to press a gentle kiss to his lips. It wasn't rushed or fueled by overwhelming passion, but by a mutual acknowledgement that what they shared had quietly blossomed into something much more than friendship or solace for his heartbreak. He made a small, startled sound, like the tiniest gasp of surprise, then eased into the kiss, fingers twining at the small of her back, drawing her closer until every inch of her felt anchored to him. They pulled apart slowly, foreheads still touching, breath mingling in the hush of the apartment. Her cheeks warmed under his gaze, and she felt acutely vulnerable, yet oddly safe. "Thank you," he whispered, though the words felt too simple for everything they conveyed. She only nodded, letting the moment speak for itself. That night, she stayed again, though this time they made an effort to be more comfortable, sharing the bed in the modest bedroom, each of them a bit shy yet relieved to find that proximity felt as natural as breathing. She fell asleep with her head on his shoulder, lulled by the steady cadence of his heartbeat and the promise that they'd face whatever came next together. Morning brought them to the highway, bound for his childhood home a couple of hours away. They packed an overnight bag, half certain they'd only stay one day, but acknowledging that old wounds might require more time to address. The drive was quiet at first. He was tense, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel, eyes flicking to the side mirror as though expecting the past to ambush them at any moment. She placed a steadying hand on his forearm, and he visibly relaxed, shoulders loosening. They arrived at a neat suburban street lined with large oaks and meticulously kept lawns. His parents' house was a 2-story brick home, stately but not ostentatious. He parked in the driveway, and for a moment, they just sat there, engine ticking in the cooling air. "You don't have to come in right away if you're not ready," Cassidy offered gently. He inhaled and shook his head. "No, I do. Let's just see what happens." The front door opened before they reached the porch, revealing a woman with Alaric's blue eyes and a worried expression. His mother, Cassidy realized. In seconds, she had Alaric in a tight embrace, tears threatening. An older man, presumably Alaric's father, joined them with a more reserved but no less sincere greeting. They seemed genuinely relieved and happy to see him, though concern radiated from both in waves. Introductions were made, Cassidy accepted an invitation to come inside, and soon they were all seated in the living room, cups of tea and polite pleasantries exchanged. Gradually, the conversation grew heavier, turning to the cancelled wedding and the heartbreak that had followed. Alaric's parents expressed regret for not reaching out more directly, while he admitted he'd been too ashamed to answer their calls. There were apologies, explanations, a few tears that no one tried too hard to hide. Cassidy observed quietly, occasionally offering a supportive look whenever Alaric's voice cracked. While the discussion was painful, she saw the weight lifting from Alaric's expression each time he confessed another piece of the hurt he'd been harboring. His parents listened, sometimes interrupting to ask questions, but mostly letting him vent. By the end of the afternoon, all three of them appeared wrung out but closer to understanding one another. The following day, Alaric's mother insisted they both stay for lunch, an event that felt surprisingly light-hearted. They passed dishes around the table, laughing at childhood memories his parents recalled. The conversation turned to Cassidy, and she answered gently probing questions about her work at the newspaper, how she'd met Alaric, and what she liked about the city. While she felt an underlying seriousness in every question, his parents were assessing if she was good for their son, she also sensed genuine warmth. By the time they announced they needed to leave, Alaric's father clapped him on the shoulder and told him not to be a stranger. His mother, eyes wet with relief, hugged him tightly, thanking Cassidy for her kindness. On the drive back, Alaric was quieter than usual, but it was a peaceful quiet, not tense. When they stopped for gas, he gently took Cassidy's hand in the parking lot, pressing a kiss to her palm. "I can't believe how badly I underestimated them," he said softly, meeting her eyes. "They were worried about me, not judging me. And it took facing them to realize it." Cassidy brushed a thumb over his cheekbone. Sometimes the hardest step is the one we take toward the people who love us but saw us fail. I'm proud of you for doing it. He pulled her in for a warm hug, resting his chin atop her head, and she closed her eyes, breathing in the faint scent of his cologne. In that embrace, she felt a final, deep sense of resolution, as though the ghosts of his nearly had wedding were loosening their grip on him once and for all. When they finally got back to his apartment late that evening, both of them exhausted from emotional upheaval, Cassidy found herself reflecting on their journey. The memory of him crumpled in the alley felt distant, though she knew it would never completely vanish, nor should it. Their first moment of contact, that desperate hug, had woven them together in a tapestry of empathy, which had since evolved into something richer, more complex. They stepped inside and exchanged a glance that brimmed with mutual gratitude. Neither needed to say much. In the warmth of the dimly lit living room, he reached for her hand again, and she guided him toward the couch where their story had quietly begun. They sank into the cushions, their fingers interlaced, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. She felt the faint stir of his breath against her temple and closed her eyes, letting a quiet contentment flood through her. Whatever path lay ahead, whatever doubts or surprises life would bring, they had chosen to walk it together, not as broken souls seeking a quick fix, but as two individuals forging a bond shaped by compassion, honesty, and the unspoken promise that genuine love could grow from the darkest moments. In the silence, he pressed a lingering kiss to her hair, and she curled closer, feeling an almost electric sense of peace. If heartbreak had shattered them once, maybe fate had also shown how shattered pieces could be reassembled into something beautiful and new. And in that quiet, unspoken understanding, they found the ending of one chapter and the tender beginnings of another, together.